This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 98. Welcome to the 98th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I started this podcast because I believe that every woman has the right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works. I'm here to connect you with the tools and information that you need to improve your menstrual cycle health and fertility, and I feel so privileged to be able to share my passion for body literacy and fertility awareness with you every single week. As you know from listening to the podcast, fertility awareness is so much more than just birth control or trying to get pregnant, because it truly gives you a window into your own health and fertility. And I love sharing my expertise with my clients and helping them to understand their charts and connect with their cycles in our work together. If you have recently discovered fertility awareness, but you're not feeling confident about using it for birth control just yet, or if you've been charting for a while and you're having trouble making sense of what's happening in your cycle, I can help. Get started today with a free 15-minute consultation with me by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/coaching, or just click the Work With Me button on my website. And I would also like to invite you to sign up for the Fertility Friday newsletter. So head over to fertilityfriday.com/ebook, and as a gift to you, you'll receive a free copy of my new ebook, where I reveal what to expect when coming off of hormonal contraceptives, and I share 5 steps to restoring healthy menstrual cycles post-pill. After releasing episode number 95, the episode that I did with Susan Rako about the impact of the pill on a woman's overall health. And specifically, we focused on a few different areas, including the connection between the hormonal birth control pill and cervical dysplasia, HPV, and cervical cancer. And that episode was a really hard-hitting episode. I received a lot of feedback from you guys. I received a lot of feedback from the audience. I had a lot of comments and emails. And so one of the questions that I get the most just across the board is about cervical mucus production and inadvertently then cervical health. And I think it's one of the things that is least talked about, cervical health. And I mean, how much time do you spend thinking about your cervix? I mean, until you started listening to the podcast, you probably never even considered your cervix. And unless your doctor actually told you that you had abnormal cells on a pap or something like that, it's not like your cervix is, front of mind. And given that we're not really taught a whole lot about our anatomy, it's not like our cervix tends to be brought to our attention. And so this episode, I wanted to focus on cervical health and cervical mucus production. And cervical mucus represents the most integral and important aspect of a woman's fertility in terms of knowing when she's fertile and when she's not. And the more uncommon aspect of cervical mucus is that a woman's cervical mucus production, at what point in the cycle it's being produced, those types of observations that you can make when you're charting your cycles, it can give so much information as to a woman's hormonal health and what's happening with her overall health in her cycle. And when you're working with someone who's trained at how to read the charts, then you can actually get a lot of information just based on how much cervical mucus she's producing or not producing, when it's being produced. And so in this episode, we're going to be talking all about the cervix and cervical mucus. So I'll start with one of the questions that I get the most from my clients as well as listeners. And you might have had this question yourself a number of times, especially if you're trying to get pregnant, but even if you've recently come off the pill and you've started charting your cycles, when you read about fertility awareness, you read about what a typical cycle is supposed to look like. And so all of the books, all of the information will tell you, okay, so you're supposed to have, this many days of menstruation, you're supposed to have this many days of mucus, you're supposed to ovulate around this time, and then, you're supposed to have this many days in your post-ovulatory phase. And so, one of the questions I get the most is, why am I not producing any mucus? Or why do I have mucus all the time? Or how do I tell the difference between different types of mucus? Or how do I tell the difference between cervical mucus and vaginal cell slough and all those different types of things? And so in particular in this episode, I'm going to address the idea. In particular in this episode, I'm going to address limited cervical mucus production and how to improve the health of your cervix. And unfortunately, there's no magic pill. There's not one thing that I can just say, okay, take this and everything will be great. And the reason for that is because there's so many different reasons why a woman's mucus production might be low. And so we're going to get into some of those topics today. There's also nothing that I can say that's going to increase your mucus production overnight, because it doesn't really work like that. And I guess the one thing to keep in mind is that as you're listening to this episode, each woman is different. And although there's a lot of different commonalities, there's a lot of different things that could be going on with you in particular. And so for instance, when I work with clients, there's not one solution that everybody gets. There's no template that I work off of, and everybody has the same, 6 things to do. There's some similarities, of course, in my approach, but there's different challenges that emerge with each individual person. Generally speaking, if a woman has limited cervical mucus production, or if that's what she's telling me, the first thing I want to establish is if there's actually a problem. And so, the most basic way of doing this is to check in with her to find out how she's actually checking her mucus. Now, as many of the long-time listeners will know, and all of my clients who are listening will know, I teach the Justice method of fertility awareness charting. And in that method, we learn a particular observational routine that involves checking for mucus externally. And this allows for us to actually identify what's there, and also to differentiate between what is actually cervical mucus and what is not. And I think that when you haven't actually had the opportunity to be taught that specific observational method, it can kind of seem a little bit frustrating for a couple different reasons. So one is because many women will find when they check externally, they find a lot less, and they might think that that's actually a problem. They might wonder, well, shouldn't I be seeing something? There's so many days that I don't see anything. What's wrong with that? When I check internally, I see something every day, but when I check externally, then, it really pares it down to just a few days a month when you're actually making mucus observations. So a couple things to say about that. One is that you're not supposed to see mucus every day. So in a healthy cycle, you're not actually going to see mucus every day. In a healthy cycle, you would have a fertile window, one kind of patch of mucus that you see, and it accompanies ovulation. And so I guess the other thing to talk a little bit about is what is actually normal. And this, again, helps us to establish whether or not there's a problem. And so in a normal, healthy menstrual cycle, so if you really want to delve into what's normal and what a healthy cycle looks like, I would suggest that you go back to the interview that I did with Colleen Flowers. In that interview, she breaks down the parameters of a healthy menstrual cycle in a ton of detail. And so that's one of the archives, and that's episode number 14. So you don't have to remember that. You can just go to the show notes page for this episode, which will be at fertilityfriday.com/98. But in episode 14, Colleen goes through all of the parameters of a healthy menstrual cycle in a lot more detail. So I'm just going to focus on what healthy mucus production would look like then in a typical cycle. So the first day of your cycle is the first day of your period. And so in a healthy cycle, you would have a period lasting about, say, 4 to 6 days. And then you would have several dry days. So you would actually have days when you wouldn't see mucus. So after your period. And then once you start to see mucus, you would expect to see a mucus cycle lasting anywhere from 3 to 6 days with an average of 4 days. And when you're observing your cervical mucus, you would expect to see at least 1 day of mucus that's clear, stretchy, or slippery. And so in the most kind of basic description, and there's a lot more to it than that, but in the most basic description, you would want to see anywhere between that 3 to 6 days of mucus with at least 1 day where you're seeing mucus that's clear, stretchy, or slippery. So what that means is that you don't have to have a week of quote unquote egg white mucus to be normal. And some women may only observe that kind of peak mucus quality once or twice. And it also doesn't mean that you're having buckets of it coming out of you like all day, every day. So some women might notice a higher quantity than others. And one thing that's really important is that it's not always a good idea to compare yourself to what other people are experiencing. Every woman is different, and you don't know how that woman is charting. You don't know what her observational routine is. You don't know if what she's observing is actually how she's marking it. And that's one of the things that I differentiate as an educator. When women come to me, often they'll have these charts where they're marking mucus every single day. And once I go through with them the observational routine and we really get down how to check for mucus and how to mark it on the chart, all of a sudden that'll go down from like 10 days of mucus to maybe 5. And that's because they may have been recording things that weren't actually mucus. So to tie this point up, the first thing that I want to do is establish if we actually have a situation where there's limited mucus, and we do that by sorting out the observational routine. And in a situation, again, where there's limited mucus, then we would be seeing less than the average, less than 3 to 6 days of a mucus cycle, and we would not be seeing at least 1 day of peak quality mucus, which is the clear, stretchy, slippery stuff. One of the things I mentioned then at the beginning of the podcast is that there's a lot of different reasons why a woman's mucus production may be low. It could be related to hormonal imbalances, it could be related to nutritional deficiencies, and it could also be related to a physical impairment of the cervix. And so let me go through a few of the different reasons why a woman might actually have limited cervical mucus. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons that a woman might have limited mucus is because her hormone levels are out of balance. Now, cervical mucus is produced in the cervix, in the cervical crypts. So if you were to take a look, if you were to magnify what your cervix looks like, and I guess I didn't actually talk a lot about the cervix. So here I am assuming that everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say cervix. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with your cervix, or you've never had the pleasure of actually touching your cervix or finding it or anything, examining the changes in your cervix throughout your menstrual cycle, your cervix is what dilates when you give birth. And so when you hear people talking about, it went from 1 centimeter dilated to 8 centimeters to 10 centimeters, they're talking about your cervix. Your cervix then is it's the bottom part of your uterus that opens when you give birth. And your cervix is, again, that opening in your uterus when you have your period. That's where the menstrual bleeding is coming out. And so it's located at the top of your vagina. So if any of you are listening and you haven't had the opportunity to familiarize yourself with your cervix, you can actually touch your cervix, and your cervix changes throughout your menstrual cycle. If you're not on hormonal contraceptives and you're having a regular menstrual cycle, you can actually observe the changes of your cervix and observe that it will change in position, so where it's located in your vagina, as well as the texture. So whether it's kind of firm on the firmer side or on the softer side, whether it's open or closed, you can actually feel those changes. And so that's kind of an aside, and I just wanted to make sure we kind of know what we're talking about. But to bring it back, one of the reasons that your cervical mucus production might be limited is if your hormones are out of balance. And the reason that I got off track is because your cervical mucus is produced in your cervix, in your cervical crypts. And that is in response to your body's production of estrogen. And so as your estrogen levels rise, your estrogen actually triggers your cervix. Estrogen has a ton of different impacts in the body, so it impacts a lot of different things. But one of the things that it impacts is your cervix and your cervical mucus production. So when your cervix changes in the texture and position, that's in relation to what's happening between the interplay of estrogen and progesterone in the body. And as a woman's estrogen levels rise, as she gets closer to ovulation, then that triggers her cervix inside the cervical crypts to produce mucus. And so if she's not producing high enough levels of estrogen, and if her body's struggling to produce the levels that she needs, then that could be one of the reasons why she's not seeing a whole lot of cervical mucus. And I mean, when it comes to hormone production in general, in order for a woman to have healthy hormone production and hormone balance, she does have to have a healthy functioning endocrine system. So for example, if a woman has a thyroid disorder, or if she has some sort of other endocrine dysfunction, then she might notice her body struggling to produce mucus. Again, if your thyroid is depressed, thyroid plays a really central role in terms of all of your hormone production, and therefore it might be related to something else. As you can see, this can get complicated because it's not just like, oh, she has less mucus, let's just do this. There's a lot of different factors that can contribute to that. And so another important factor that could contribute to low mucus production is nutrient deficiencies specifically. One of the things that I've talked about in a number of different episodes, and a lot of my guests have spoken about, is that when a woman is on hormonal contraceptives for a long period of time, it actually depletes her body of very specific nutrients. And it turns out that a lot of the nutrients that the pill depletes from the body are critical to cervical health. And so, this takes us back to the interview that I did with Susan Rayco, episode number 95, because basically the pill is making it really, really hard for your cervix to be healthy in a number of different ways. And so we talked about how the pill depresses immune function, and that makes a woman more susceptible to HPV. Some critical nutrients for cervical health include B vitamins, vitamin A, and folate in particular. And these vitamins are really critical for cervical health in general, as well as cervical mucus production. And when a woman's on the pill, those are some of the key nutrients that the pill specifically is depleting from her body. And as a result of that, it could also be related to nutrient deficiencies. So if your cervix doesn't have what it needs to be healthy and function optimally, that could be one of the reasons that you're experiencing limited mucus production, especially if you've been on hormonal contraceptives for a while. And so 2 more things that could be kind of things that you'd want to definitely consider to see if these could be factors for you. So one of the things as well is procedures. So an actual physical issue with your cervix. And this comes full circle with episode number 95. If a woman has been on hormonal contraceptives for a long period of time, as we talked about in that episode, it unfortunately increases her chance of having abnormal cells. From what we gathered from the episode, a lot of us, if not most of us, or if not all of us, are exposed to HPV at some point in time. There's tons of different strains of HPV. And so if you're sexually active, at any point in your life, it's very likely that you're exposed to it. But when a woman is healthy and when she has healthy immune function and when she's not on hormonal contraceptives, her body is better able to defend her. We all know that we have some degree of defense from bugs, I guess you could say. We all know that in kind of flu season, there are people that tend to get sick a lot, and there are people that tend not to. And so you probably have someone in your life who they have like a quote unquote good constitution or whatever, and they just don't get sick. My dad's like that. He just, you can throw whatever you want at him. He's been a teacher for like 50 years or something, and he is just not one to get sick. So back to the point, when a woman is not on hormonal contraceptives and she has healthy immune function, her body's then actually fighting off the HPV and she's not susceptible to it. But for a woman who is on hormonal contraceptives, the contraceptives, especially the longer she takes them, have a negative impact on her immune system, make her more susceptible to the HPV virus, and then that could make her more likely to have abnormal cells. So this is something that's more and more common. When a woman then has abnormal cells, what happens? Well, oftentimes her doctor will suggest that she has them removed. And so that involves surgical surgery. There's a lot of different procedures. I'm not going to go through all the different options for how to get rid of cervical cells, but suffice it to say, the cells are often physically removed from the body in one way or another. And one of the risk factors of that then, in terms of cervical mucus production in the future, is that if you're physically removing a part of a woman's cervix, you're physically removing some of the cervical crypts that actually then produce mucus. So one of the things that just irritates me a whole lot about the topic of increasing cervical mucus production is that if you go and Google, how do I increase my cervical mucus production, you'll get tons and tons of articles telling you to take this or take that or whatever. But if a woman has a physical limitation, so if she's had a cervical surgery that's actually removed a part of her cervix, it doesn't mean that she can't produce mucus production, and it doesn't mean that she can't support her body, support her hormone levels, and really optimize, the mucus production. But it does mean that she might have a different situation than someone who's never had that type of surgery done. And so that's why this issue is so complex, because there's not just like one size fits all for every woman. There's different considerations that we have to make. And another factor then that goes along with long-term pill use is that, the pill works in a number of different ways. And so I cover some of this in my ebook. So if you've recently come off the pill and you haven't had a chance to check out my ebook, you can go to, fertilityfriday.com/ebook, where I talk a little bit more about these things and what the pill is actually doing in your body. But suffice it to say that when a woman's on the pill, she's not producing fertile quality mucus. That's one of the key ways that the pill prevents pregnancy. That's one of the reasons that it's really effective. So what the pill does is it encourages the cervix to produce what's called G-type mucus, which is basically a mucus plug that prevents the sperm from being able to penetrate the cervix. And so the longer a woman's on the pill, it actually can change the crypts. So, without going into like a huge science lesson here, let's just say that your cervix is amazing. It's really just fascinating. And the way that, Mother Nature designed your cervix is that there's actually different crypts that produce different types of mucus. So if you look inside a woman's body, you can really study it and there's been a lot of research done. So let's just say that there's different crypts in different parts of your cervix that produce different types of mucus. And so when a woman is on the pill, the longer and longer she's on the pill, it can actually have an impact on her cervix in a physical way, where she ends up having less crypts that produce the fertile quality mucus and more crypts that produce kind of that mucus plug. So, it's all bad news. And I don't say this to frustrate women. I get a lot of emails too from listeners that are just like, man, I wish I would have known. I've been on the pill for 15 years. And so it's not all doom and gloom. Our bodies are able to rejuvenate. And there's a lot of things that we can do to encourage the body to heal. So I'm not saying this to say that any of this is a life sentence, but I'm saying this to give a better picture. So these are some of the reasons why your mucus production may be limited. Not all of them might apply to you, but some of them may. And this is why it's, like I said, it's a complex issue, and there's not just like one answer because there's all of these different things. So when a client comes to me with limited cervical mucus production, we do a full client history and really look into what are some of the reasons why this might be happening for you. And then we work towards addressing those. And it's not something that happens overnight. So for example, if a woman has a thyroid condition and it's affecting her hormonal balance, that's not something you can address overnight. There's a whole bunch of different steps involved in assessing the situation and then supporting the body and supporting the thyroid and to get a woman back to optimal health. So what I want you to take, I guess, from this part of this podcast episode today just is to the most basic part. There's a lot of different reasons why a woman may have limited cervical mucus production. So I want to encourage you to shift the mindset from, okay, so I just have to I'll throw out vitamin D. I always say that, but I just have to take vitamin D and my cervix is going to be fine. We have to kind of shift away from that really simple-minded understanding of what's happening and really start to understand that there's a lot of different factors at play that could be contributing to this problem. And the other thing that I'm going to reiterate again is that there's really this amazing capacity that our bodies have to heal. And this is not meant to leave you feeling hopeless. It's meant to give you the tools that you need. First, we need to address the hard truth, and then we can talk about what to do about it. So in this last section of today's episode, I want to talk about different ways to boost cervical mucus production. In my typical fashion, I'm not going to give you a list of supplements and just say that's all you have to do, but we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can actually impact your health, boost your hormone production, and also in turn then boost your cervical mucus production. So the first thing that you can do is address any kind of dietary or lifestyle issues that could be messing with your hormones. So this is like the cover your bases to make sure that it's not just that you're kind of eating crappy food and not doing the basic things that you need to do to support your body's hormone production. So this is kind of like back to basics. Let's figure out what's happening with you. And so, I mean, some of the things you'll want to focus on are doing things and eating foods that will support hormone production. And one of the things that I've talked about on so many different episodes, and so many of my guests have really focused on this, is going back to basics, eating real food, and making sure that you're getting enough healthy fats into your diet. And kind of that reminder that cholesterol is the precursor to every steroid hormone in your body. And in order for you to produce enough estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and cortisol, all the different hormones that you need to produce in order to have healthy reproductive function, you need to actually be giving your body the building blocks to create those hormones. And so in order to ensure that you have balanced hormones and that your body is supported in producing the hormones that it needs to, we need to focus on getting enough healthy fats. And so that's healthy saturated fats. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. One of the ways that you can do that, if you tolerate dairy products, if it's something that you can tolerate, I always encourage my clients to get the healthiest version of whatever food that they're able to get. And so if you can tolerate dairy products, whole raw dairy from a local farmer with, excellent farming practices is one way to ensure that you're getting healthy fats into your diet, or incorporating things like raw cheese, switching from using industrial seed oils, so often called vegetable oils. So getting rid of the canola oils or all of those vegetable oils for cooking, because those oils are highly inflammatory and they're not giving your body the raw materials that it needs to create those steroid hormones. And so, switching out any vegetable oils that you're cooking with and switching to coconut oil, butter, lard, ghee, and again, from sources, the best sources that you can. And if you're getting butter, you want to try to get butter that is from animals that are not being given hormones or antibiotics. And same thing. So finding healthy, stable, saturated fats for cooking. And so a great episode to listen to is episode number 12 that I did with Laura Schoenfeld. And she actually goes into great detail and talks about the fats and breaks down the different kinds of fats and why saturated fats are more stable for cooking, so that you get a sense of why we would want to get rid of some of those vegetable oils, especially when we're heating food. So healthy saturated fats, and then also ensuring that you're getting a good balance between omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. So one of the kind of hidden ways that we get a lot of omega-6 or other inflammatory vegetable oils in our diet is processed foods. And so if you're eating processed foods, I love my chips, and so I am not perfect in this process either, but it's again making sure that you're not kind of going overboard and you're having a balance. And so other ways to incorporate healthy fats would be eating fish, incorporating something like cod liver oil into your daily practice, into your diet. Cod liver oil has high levels of vitamin A as well as omega-3 fatty acids. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about vitamin A as I go through, but that's a good place to start, making sure you're getting your healthy saturated fats so that your body can actually produce the hormones that it needs. And as I've alluded to already, eating actual food. So eating as many one ingredient foods as you can. So what's an example of a one ingredient food? An apple or a banana or broccoli or something like that. So incorporating as much kind of healthy fruits and vegetables as you can, and trying to stay away as much as you can from processed foods. Another key thing that I've talked about a lot on the podcast, and this is again going back to basics, but getting enough sleep. Sleep is really critical for hormone balance. And yes, I am talking about ways to improve cervical mucus production, but before you go and throw in a bunch of supplements, you have to cover the basics, because the supplements by themselves will be a lot more effective if you're supporting your body's health in the most basic ways. And so, some guidelines for sleep. In a perfect world, we'd be able to get to sleep by 9 o'clock. But, try to get to bed, if you can't get to bed by 9, by 10 and 11 at the latest. And then make sure to assess your sleep environment so that you're sleeping in total darkness, those types of things. And then try to get enough sleep. Try to get, at least that 7 hours of sleep, restful sleep. So if you want, again, more information, more detailed specifics on sleep, I'll link in the podcast show notes a few different episodes where I talked about sleep. So I did an interview with Sean Stevenson where we talked all about sleep. We talked about his book, Sleep Smarter. And I also did an episode with Joy DeFelice. And in that episode, we talked about the importance of sleeping in complete darkness and the impact that has on your hormone levels. So again, we're covering the bases here. And so one other factor, and there's a ton of other things that you can do kind of in general to help to balance your hormones. So I'm just listing a few just kind of key ones. But the last one that I'll talk about is to reduce your xenoestrogen exposure. So again, I did an entire episode on reducing your xenoestrogen exposure. And so I'll link that to the show notes as well. What's a xenoestrogen? They're chemicals in the environment that mimic estrogen in our bodies. So when we are exposed to these chemicals, our body thinks that they're estrogen. And so they actually act in our bodies the same way that the estrogen that we would produce acts. And this helps to throw off our hormones in a bunch of different ways. And so they're everywhere. So if you kind of do a little assessment of your house, anything that has a great fruity smell at all contains a xenoestrogenic chemical. And so that can be anything from hand lotion to shampoo and conditioner to the stuff you wash your clothes with, to fabric softener, to apple fresh dish soap, to household cleaners. The list just goes on and on and on and on. And if this is the first podcast episode you're listening and you're thinking, does she want me to throw away every single thing I have, every cleaning product, every beauty product? Is this like, this woman's crazy? Don't let it overwhelm you. What I always encourage my clients, and of course my listeners, to do is to start somewhere. Don't throw everything out. Pick one thing. So if this seems overwhelming to you, literally pick one thing that you could replace. What if it was dish soap? What if you could buy the non-scented, gentle dishwashing soap and change that out? That's one thing you can do. I don't know about you, but I wash a lot of dishes in my house. And so just changing that means that I'm not smelling apple fresh for however many times a day I wash dishes. So take it back to basics. Don't let it overwhelm you. Don't think about the whole, every possible thing, but just pick one thing that you could change. By doing those things, so just to kind of summarize, adding healthy fats, making sure that you're switching out, stable saturated fats and switching those out from the vegetable oils if you're still cooking with those. Making sure to eat real food so that you're eating as many one ingredient foods as possible. Going to sleep before, 11 o'clock, 10 p.m. is even better, and 9 p.m. is ideal. And trying to get enough restful sleep in the dark. And reducing your xenoestrogen exposure. Those are, if you do those things, or even start to incorporate some of those ideas into your lifestyle, that can play a huge role in balancing your hormones. When you start to balance your hormones, you're basically getting out of your body's way and allowing your body to do what it wanted to do in the first place. And so when you have a healthy balance of hormone levels, you're supporting your cervix in producing cervical mucus. The second point that I wanted to talk about for boosting cervical mucus production is to flood your body with nutrition by incorporating fertility foods. As I talked about in the beginning of this episode, one of the factors that can contribute to low cervical mucus production is nutrient deficiency. And again, that's because your cervix needs to have certain nutrients in order to function optimally. And if you've been on hormonal contraceptives for a long period of time, that can actually deplete your body of these nutrients. But the particular nutrients that are depleted by hormonal birth control they just also happen to be critical nutrients for cervical health. And so one of the ways to support cervical mucus production is to support cervical health. And so there's a ton of different ways that you can start just flooding your body with nutrition. And I don't think it's going to surprise any of you. And if you're one of my clients listening, it's not going to surprise you at all because of course this is at the top of my list. But one of the ways to support your body's nutrition and to really flood your body back with the nutrition and the nutrients that you've been missing is to eat liver and organ meats. And if you're not into actually consuming them, then you can also look into, other types of products. So you can buy desiccated liver capsules where you don't actually have to eat it physically if it irks you or if it grosses you out, I should say. But incorporating grass-fed liver and organ meats. So why am I always on with the liver and organ meats? Well, liver and organ meats are like a natural vitamin. So if Mother Nature, designed a vitamin, she did, and it's actually liver. And so liver and organ meats are highly concentrated, nutritious foods. So if you're eating those types of foods, you're flooding your body with B vitamins in a usable form. So you're giving your body information that it understands and can incorporate into your cells. So B vitamins, iron, magnesium, selenium, even vitamin C, vitamin D. There's just so many nutrients that are really important for cervical health, but also vitamin A. And so there's several key nutrients that are really important for cervical mucus production. B vitamins are really important, B12, B6, folate. And so if you're eating liver and organ meats, you're giving your body those nutrients. Also, vitamin A is really critical for cervical health. And by eating liver and organ meats, they are naturally high in vitamin A in a balanced way because it's a food. And so you're giving your body all of these nutrients and the cofactors as well that we don't even fully understand because it's food, and to really support your body's nutrition. So that's one way. It doesn't mean that you have to, get it that way, but that's one really effective way of flooding your body with nutrients. Another option in terms of food is incorporating eggs, again, if you tolerate them. And again, trying to aim for the best quality, the highest quality eggs. So that would be kind of free range eggs if you have a local farmer's market or something like that where you can grab some eggs. So eggs, we talked a lot about saturated fat. So eggs are high in cholesterol, saturated fat, that what your body needs in order to produce those hormones, and also full of the nutrients, again, to flood your body with the nutrients it needs to do what it needs to do. And I've already mentioned, raw, unpasteurized, full fat milk. Again, if you want to kind of learn more about eating this way, in episode number 9, the episode that I recorded with Sally Fallon Morrell, she talks about diet specifically through the Weston A. Price guidelines. And in general, then when you're eating, meat, when you're sourcing meat products, you want to look for the cleanest meats you can find and that you can afford. So ideally, you would be looking not necessarily for organic meat, but for local meat that is raised locally, close to you by farmers who don't use hormones or antibiotics, and ideally have their animals on pasture so that the animals themselves are actually healthy. And when you have an animal that's on pasture, that's raised ethically, that is basically eating the foods that it's supposed to, then you end up having more nutrient dense meat and foods. Basically, what I'm suggesting that you do is incorporate some fertility foods specifically. So foods that have been identified to have a high nutrient density and, a ton of important nutrients that are key in fertility. And so really this is about incorporating nutrient-dense foods on purpose to give your body the building blocks that it needs to make the hormones that it needs. And more specifically, to give your cervix the key nutrients that it needs in order to be healthy and in order to produce healthy cervical mucus. So some other fertility foods are shellfish, things like oysters, clams, mussels, fish eggs. This, again, if you are able to tolerate these foods, those foods have tons of nutrients, including zinc. And zinc is found in shellfish and different types of foods like that, and also has been implicated in cervical mucus production. So just to summarize that point, you're wanting to incorporate nutrient-dense foods to support your cervix specifically, to flood your body with nutrients and to replenish the nutrient stores that may have been depleted if you have a history of hormonal contraceptive use. And the final point that I wanted to talk about in terms of boosting your cervical mucus production is focusing on increasing your intake of the nutrients that are key to cervical health. And so throughout this entire podcast, I've spoken about these nutrients already. But here I'm just going to focus on them so that you kind of have an idea of what nutrients are key to cervical health. And so again, since our cervical mucus is produced in the cervix, you want to focus on the nutrients that your cervix needs in order to be healthy. And so there's several nutrients that play a key role in cervical health. One of them is folate. And folate has been indicated for treatment of cervical dysplasia. So one of the great things about your cervix is that, again, at the beginning of the podcast episode, I went through a bunch of different reasons why a woman's cervical mucus production may be low. And one of those was, increased susceptibility to HPV, abnormal cells, and then lending itself to potentially having a cervical procedure. Well, it turns out that you can actually address abnormal cervical cells naturally by focusing on replacing key nutrients to cervical health. And folate is one of those nutrients. And so one of the things you want to do is make sure that you're getting enough folate. If you focus on the fertility foods that I talked about in the previous section, that's one way to get a lot of folate into your diet. Coming from organ meats, liver, those types of things, there's tons of food that are high in folate. And so to really try to incorporate those foods into your diet. But also, of course, you can supplement with folate. And again, you can take a look back at episode number 54, the episode that I did with Diane Ketty, where she talked about the MTHFR gene mutation. And so from that episode and several of the other episodes I've talked about, if you're wanting to supplement with folate, it's a good idea to be on the safe side and go for the methylated version. So something that says folate or methylfolate or 5-MTHF or something of that nature. Vitamin B6 is another key vitamin nutrient that has been indicated for cervical mucus production. Vitamin B6 is something that's actually found in raw foods. So if you're drinking raw milk, for example, or if you like your eggs a little bit on the runny side, then those are some ways that you can naturally get vitamin B6. B12. So, in general, B vitamins are really important for fertility, for fetal development, for cervical health. And most of the time, if a woman is concerned about her cervical mucus production, ultimately she's also concerned about her ability to conceive, or she's trying to conceive, or she's trying to figure out when her fertile days are. So generally the point is to conceive and have a healthy baby. And so all of these nutrients that I'm discussing here for cervical health are also really critical for fertility and also for fetal development and for having a healthy pregnancy and ultimately a healthy baby. So B vitamins play a really critical role there. And finally, I've touched on this quite a bit. Vitamin A is really, really important for cervical health. And we're talking about preformed vitamin A, then from animal sources. So some of the sources of vitamin A, as we talked about, liver and organ meats. and, cod liver oil are really high sources of naturally occurring vitamin A. With vitamin A in particular, it's a good idea as much as possible to obtain your vitamin A through food sources naturally. There's some concerns with supplementing specifically with vitamin A and getting too much, but when you're getting vitamin A through food sources, then it's a lot safer. And that's something that I spoke about as well in my interview with Sally Fallon in episode 9. So you can definitely take a look back at that episode for more information. And so again, I am not a doctor. I am not playing one on the internet. So this is not intended to just be medical advice. This is intended for informational purposes. And ultimately, the picture that I really wanted to paint for you is that cervical health is not just some super easy, like 2 supplement and you're done type situation. There's a lot of different factors that can contribute to limited cervical mucus production or other challenges infertility related to cervical mucus production. And so if this is something that you've been struggling with for a while, or if you have been, trying everything that you see in different articles and like, oh, what do I do this week? I'm going to try this supplement. I'm going to try this herb. And you haven't really been making any progress, then one of the things you want to consider is the benefit of actually working with somebody who can assist you and provide you with the information that you need, who can read your charts and who can really assess the situation individually. There's no one thing that works for every single person. And I hope the message that you got from this podcast is that everybody's situation is different and there's not just one answer. If someone comes to me with any concern, the response from me is typically 15 to 20 different questions so that I can establish exactly what's happening for that person. To summarize what we talked about today, when trying to figure out what to do if a woman has limited cervical mucus production, the first thing that we want to do is really identify, is there really a problem? So we want to figure out if she's observing her cervical mucus correctly. We want to compare what she's actually observing with what's normal and find out, first of all, if we actually have a problem. The second thing that we want to do is understand that there are several different factors that can contribute to limited cervical mucus production. And then the third thing we want to do is really work on the different things that we can do to boost cervical mucus production. And as we've talked about, we want to address the whole person. We want to look at the whole person to make sure that they're addressing the most basic level of, dietary lifestyle guidelines to make sure that we're doing everything we can to support normal hormone production. We want to really focus on replacing the nutrients that may have been depleted, especially if the woman has a history of hormonal contraceptive use. So we really want to focus on foods that are going to support the body and to replenish the nutrients that were depleted or that may have been depleted. And then finally, we want to focus on specific nutrients that are indicated for cervical health. And that's a great place to start. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I just wanted to jump on and do a bonus episode today, especially after releasing episode number 95 with Dr. Susan Rako. I just found that the response of it was just kind of overwhelming, and I really wanted to take some time to talk about what to do about it. And so I hope this episode has given you some ideas and some insight into some of the key factors that are critical to cervical health, key nutrients, and just to kind of get the conversation going around this really important topic. So if you haven't had a chance to join my Facebook community, head over to fertilityfriday.com/community. I'd love to talk more about this topic in there with you, and I would love for you to share your own experiences. If you've ever experienced an abnormal PAP, if you've ever had a cervical procedure done, if you do have a history of hormonal birth control use, or if any of this information really affected you or impacted you or even clarified some things for you, I would love to hear from you. And so you can jump into the Facebook community and we can talk about it more there. Also, if you enjoyed today's episode, I would appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would benefit from it. And you'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/98. Of course, if you've been enjoying the podcast, please look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. And make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com and join my email list. And as I mentioned earlier as well, if you do have a history of hormonal contraceptive use and you're trying to figure out what's normal when you're coming off of the pill, make sure to go to fertilityfriday.com/ebook and grab a copy of that. And I love hearing from you. If you have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, send me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. And I just want to thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really appreciate all of you for taking the time to tune into the podcast and let me be part of your day. And I love hearing from you. I love getting emails from you and seeing the comments on the show notes page and the comments in the Facebook group. It really helps to connect me with all of you so that I don't just feel like I'm alone in my basement. It's been really fun to be able to connect with you and to be able to get a sense of who I'm talking to. So thanks so much. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.